So welcome to the third video in the introduction of our parenting class, and we're going to be talking quite practically now about some of the philosophies we've just spoken about and how we actually apply them. And the whole focus is putting an ethical foundation in the lives of our kids so that they can take that into adulthood with them. Michael Novak once said that the free society is a moral society, or it's not free at all. I prefer the term ethics. I think ethics describes what we're aiming at better than just morals. But we do need a vast majority of the population to be ethical in the way they interpret things for a society to be free. And of course that has much bigger implications for us as believers into eternity. But for while we're here on earth, how do we go about this process of putting an ethical standard, a moral standard, into our children's lives? So the first thing we realize is that we are not just facilitators of the home, mom and dad. If you're a single parent, you're not just the facilitator of your home, that you just kind of try and get everything balanced. You actually are a guide and a lead in your home. And it's good for us to know that we have a conscience, that our children have a conscience. So that conscience can be abused at times, but it's there for a purpose. God's made it for a reason. And it operates in a very amazing way. It almost operates like a second version of yourself, who is constantly critiquing your work, approving of what you do when you do things well, disapproving when you don't do things well. And Paul describes it well in Romans chapter 2, verses 14 to 15. He says, "Indeed, when Gentiles who do not have the law do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts, their consciences also bearing witness, their thoughts sometimes accusing them and other times defending them." So you see this with children. There's some ethics that's built in, but there's others that needs to be implanted or learned as we teach them. And so let's look at a few practical things about how we go about this process. You lead us into there, Megs.
Well, I know that when we were parenting Daniel in the early years, you would often say to me, Meg, don't expect the harvest while you're still plowing.
Yeah.
And, as a mom, it's really, I think, particularly important to remember that, because often we're the ones that are at home, we're doing the day-to-day correcting and trying to get the pleases and thank yous right in our children. And it can be quite overwhelming. It feels like all we're doing is saying no or don't touch, and that's often the first word that our children learn is no. And we can't always, or it's hard for us to see the bigger picture. And so just to remember that the fruit will come if we are consistent in what we're doing. Mm-hmm. If we are sticking to the plan makes sense, and we're working at this together, then oftentimes we're surprised because it does happen.
Yes.
And
yes.
It's worth sticking at.
Yeah, there's a passage in Galatians, I think it is, which speaks about you will don't stop doing good. You will reap a harvest if you don't give up. And the temptation, I think, is often to give up.
And often you think, you must be doing something wrong. And then just because you're trying something for a while, it doesn't seem to be producing the results. You try something else. And that in itself can be confusing for the child. And so, stick at something, and it needs to be based in biblically, but stick at it and work at it together. So, that's really important.
Yes. The other one, which we've used a lot with Daniel, is reinforcing what we're teaching in non-conflict moments. And there's a couple of examples we have on that. But just the concept is a good one, because what's removed from it is the tension and the conflict. And we're able to point to some behavior, maybe his own behavior, that needs correcting without that emotion part of it. Maybe give us some examples.
Yeah, I think, as Alan said, at the moment, that's when we try and do the teaching. We're telling them what they're doing wrong.
Yes. And
we're frustrated, they're frustrated, sometimes there's tears. And often we're not reasonable, and they're not ready to receive whatever correction you're trying to bring. And so that's not normally a good time to try and bring the correction. But when everybody is calm, and oftentimes we don't want to because we're just enjoying the peace and quiet. But there are so many everyday opportunities to point out in our children and that they can learn from. And an example could be, you could be going to the store with your child, and maybe another child is throwing a tantrum or doing something wrong, and that's a good moment to just say, little Johnny, what do you think about that? Do you think that child responded to their parent in a good way? And oftentimes they, even if they had an episode in the store yesterday, a similar kind of one, they can look at it objectively and say, no, that they didn't respond well in that situation. And so it's a teachable moment. And as I say, they're all around us. When we're coming out of the store and we have our shopping cart with us, and we've got maybe a baby in arms and a toddler, and it's just easier to push the cart to the side and not take it to the demarcated area. Well, they're looking and they're watching, and it would be easy for them to say, Mom and Dad, you expect us to do the right thing, but you don't do the right thing. And so they're watching, and they're little sponges. They're taking in every little thing that we're doing and mimicking what we're doing, which is often quite daunting to realize as a parent.
And remember, our goal there is not to judge another parent, another situation. You actually are using somebody else's difficult moment to teach your child, but you have your difficult moments too. They have your children have their difficult moments. So it's not about who's the better parent, who judging. It's about using whatever you have around you to learn.
Another example could be that we used to play these little games with Daniel where we would give him scenarios.
Yes.
We'd say to him, Johnny is going to visit his auntie and uncle, and when he walks in there, they're going to say to him, "Hello, Johnny. Wow, you've grown. I haven't seen you for a long time. What would be the most appropriate response?" And then we'd give 3 or 4 scenarios. 1 or 2 of them were really ridiculous. Some of them are humorous. And of course, there's the correct one there. And Daniel would just delight in hearing the crazy ones, and of course, loving the fact that he could pick the correct ones. And so, you don't think they're learning, but actually, in those scenarios, they are learning all the time. And he would ask us to play those games, and so it's just another way that you can try and get some of those principles in.
I remember at one point when Daniel was little, probably about 3 or 4. Late going somewhere, he's in the back seat looking over my shoulder, notices that I'm speeding. Maybe he was older than 3 or 4. And says, "Dad, well, that's against the law. You shouldn't be driving so fast." It's important at those moments to take a bit of correction ourselves, because how can I expect my son to obey the laws that he doesn't understand if I'm not prepared to obey the laws that are given to me? And so those are very important things. Meg alluded to that sidestepping of ethical requirements that we have. We explain it away as to but I'm an adult and I'm in a rush. One of the ones that she spoke about was the shopping cart scenario. When you use a shopping cart, that shopping cart belongs to the store. It wouldn't be right for it to be a free agent blowing around the parking lot, bashing into people's cars. It's up to us ethically to take care of that, put it somewhere where it's going to be safe, take it back to the store maybe if required. These are the kinds of things we want to be putting into our kids. You'll notice when you do this that these moral, ethical foundations have a profound effect on kids. They teach kids how to think. They teach them how to hold an opinion objectively, even though they're not engaged in it. When we don't require these things from children, we in essence stunting their intellectual growth. We're stunting their sometimes even their physical growth in terms of nutrition, and those we'll get into that at a later stage. But your moral foundations are the very, very first ones, and everything else is dependent on them. What about talking about the owner setting the value of a particular item? How do we we bring that to our kids' lives?
Yeah, I think, before I get to that specific point, just even in their own things that they own, toys, it's quite easy for them to have the attitude of, this is a cheap toy. This is it's an old toy.
Yeah.
And so therefore it's okay for me to not pack it away, or it's okay for me to leave it outside, or it's okay
even to break it intentionally.
Absolutely. That, they can easily have that, make that assessment themselves, and come to those conclusions. But I think it's really good for us to teach them that they actually need to respect and look after books, or they need to look after their toys and pack them away, and then there's other people's toys as well that they need to look after, and if they break, then they need to let the authority in charge know, and then replace it if necessary.
Yeah.
So those are good things, to not let them make up their mind that it's 2 years old, it doesn't really matter, or I broke it and it was only a silly little cheap toy. Sometimes those silly little cheap toys to somebody else might be very precious and very dear.
Might have sentimental value, yeah.
Sure. And so, we sometimes just sometimes through our own attitudes, we can, our children can glean that from us.
Yes.
But we also need to let them know that everything that we have is actually given to us by God. And we need to be good stewards of everything that He's given us. And therefore we don't get to decide that this is old or that's old, and therefore based on that we get to not look after it.
Yes. C.S. Lewis makes a point in one of his books about ownership. He speaks, I think he was speaking about the Word of God that we are given it. But he says it's a bit like a child is given a teddy bear, and that child is given a teddy bear not with the view that he can rip it to pieces if it likes, but it's given the teddy bear in order to love and nurture and cherish. That's a moral foundation we want in our kids, and understanding that ownership doesn't mean you get to do what you want. Freedom doesn't mean you get to do what you want. There's a much greater freedom beyond that, and we want that to be part of their thinking. So these are some guidelines and things that we want to establish in our kids' lives. Maybe another one is when we deal with our children's private world. So we're wanting children to enter into the adult world as contributors. It's much harder to build something than it is to break something apart. So teaching them to build rather than to break is, I think, a very healthy thing. We need to do the same when it comes to our children. And you'll notice as they get older and their little personalities begin to develop, that every now and again they give us little glimpses into their private world. It might be a quiet time before bed, or it could be in the middle of the busyness of the day, that they give us a little glimpse into their private world, what's going on in their thinking, and it might be a very personal thing. Really believe this is a wonderful tool from the Growing Kids God's Way series. Really believe that it's not a moment for us to come in and start making accusations or start rearranging their thinking. Oh, don't think like that, or you think more like this. Those moments are very precious. An example would be maybe a young girl in the early teens who one night asks her dad if he thinks that the boys think that she's pretty. Very easy for a dad of a girl that age to say, "What are you thinking about boys? You need to be focusing on your schoolwork," and complete overreaction. That's a moment where she's inviting you into her private world, her private thoughts, and tread very carefully when that happens. Because if we don't tread carefully, they stop inviting us into those insights in their thinking. And we don't want that. We want to keep that open, even if those discussions become very difficult and there's admission of sin later on, and we want that channel to remain open, so we tread carefully.
I think also, sometimes the things that they think about or worried about as adults, we can quite easily write off as insignificant, and just by our comments, or maybe we're too busy,
Yeah,
that can shut them down as well. And so we really need to be attentive to the promptings of the Holy Spirit as to, this is a time to pause, this is a time to stop, this is a time to listen. And maybe that's all you do is listen and encourage them, pray with them. Maybe it calls for some advice, but just to not be too busy as parents.
Yes.
Because there are opportunities all the time, and we need to be looking out for them when they present themselves.
So in moral foundation establishment or ethical foundation establishment, this is a role for both mom and dad. Children are developing a value of themselves, and they're looking at mom and dad as guides. If dad is alive on this planet, I'm talking particularly to the dads, then his role is pivotal. Not all dads are alive. Some dads have left. And not all families have access to dad, or dad doesn't agree maybe, or mom doesn't agree. She's living somewhere else and she doesn't agree with this approach. How do we apply these principles when maybe children are leaving the home for a weekend or maybe for a full week and coming back with a whole new set of values, undoing all that we've tried to implement? One of the key elements here that I think people miss, and it's sad to me, but I understand why, and that is the role of church. There are dads and moms and adults in a community that can play a very, very important role in kids' lives. I mean, I think back to teachers and uncles and aunties and others, friends, family friends, who played phenomenally important, pivotal, directional roles in my life. Even though that I had a good home, that I came from, stable home. I think that it's important to rely, it's important that we are involved in a church, particularly a church where that kind of interaction takes place. And so I want to encourage you, if you are a single parent and you're wondering, how do I apply this when it seems to be undone when they're with the other parents, don't discount the role of church. I would put it this way: look for a church that practices Matthew 18 conflict resolution. If it's that kind of church that practices it according to Matthew 18, then that's a really good place for you to help you establish the moral foundation in your children's lives. It leads us to accountability, how we need each other. We need each other as mom and dad. We need children. Sometimes we need the faith that the children supply. We also need each other as parents. And I spoke earlier in one of the videos about judging, how easy it is to judge. Oh, I'm so glad we're not like that family over there. Well, each family's got its strengths, each family's got its weaknesses, and sometimes we need each other to see some of those things. Do you have relationships? Maybe they are your own siblings or people related to you. Maybe that's in church. Do you have relationships where you can trust those people to tell you, hey, this thing looks like it might be going wrong in your family's life or in your child's life. You might want to address it. Tell the story a little bit about that teacher that we had when we were leading kids ministry, and Daniel was entering into children's ministry and his commitment to us.
Yeah, I think we had a young man, a young teacher that his sort of philosophy in teaching was, if the child misbehaved in children's church, then he required them to tell their parent what they did, what he did wrong, what he or she did wrong. And occasionally the teacher would come and talk to us, but this particular time he said to Daniel, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes after church to go and talk to your parents. And he duly did. He came and told us what he did wrong. And a few minutes later, the teacher came up to us and just said, I'm just checking, did Daniel come and speak to you? And we were able to discuss it and sort out the issue. And, those things are maybe a little awkward to handle. But we as parents were very grateful
Yes.
that there was somebody. He wasn't his aim wasn't to, get Daniel into trouble or anything like that. His aim was to grow Daniel into all the potential that he saw in him. And so that kind of help is actually really, really good to embrace. Not get offended, not just think, well, I'm not coming back because, my child is being picked on, but actually trust the leadership and get them involved. And you alluded to this a little earlier about single parents of, particularly boys when they get older, and sometimes there can be some difficulties to identify some teachers or leadership in the church that you can include into building a relationship with your son or your daughter for that matter, so that when it requires a man's voice to come alongside, to encourage, to point in the direction, that those relationships are established.
Yes.
I know we played that role for many young children as there were single parents that we dealt with, to try and bring them along and point them to God in every way.
Yes. I remember James Dobson in his book Dare to Discipline, he talks about doing a book signing. I think this was in one of the other versions of it, because he was signing for Dare to Discipline, and his family went along with him to this church to talk about the book. And as he's busy signing it, he's aware that his kids are running wild somewhere. He can hear crashing, and he's signing his book Dare to Discipline. It's very important that we realize this is a journey we are all on, and that we don't judge each other. Galatians 6:4 says that each one should test his own actions, then he can take pride in himself. I think it's true for parenting, and it's true for families. It's a wonderful, wonderful journey. If we can have as our starting place, I want my children to be ethical human beings when they're adults, then I think we can go a very, very long